Hi, welcome to the Washington Post special report on the coronavirus or COVID-19. I'm Libby Casey, and I'm joining you from my home here in Washington, D.C. So thanks for bearing with us as we all adjust to this new normal and the way that we bring you broadcasts. I want to start with some of the latest news that we're tracking. Well, the number of global cases has topped 1 million, and a reminder that nearly a quarter of those are right here in the United States. And sadly, yesterday was a record one-day death toll for this country. Just this week, the UN Secretary General called the pandemic the most challenging crisis faced since World War II. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is calling for another stimulus bill. That's even as Americans are waiting to get payments from that first bill that was passed and signed into law by the president last week. She wants to see things like more money for individuals, small business loans, and those beefed up unemployment benefits extended. And the nation's top infectious disease expert, Anthony Fauci, says he doesn't know why every state doesn't have a stay-at-home order in place. We're still seeing a patchwork of decisions made on state and local levels. And we'll talk about that later on in this hour. We're also going to talk later on about parents and how parents are somehow managing to do the impossible, which is like 5 different jobs at once. And that's if they're lucky. So we'll get to that later on. But I want to first welcome my guests for this segment, Heather Long, economics correspondent, and Tony Rome, tech policy reporter. Thanks so much to both of you for being with us. We really appreciate it. Heather, let's start with how the nation is tracking unemployment and joblessness. We saw some numbers come out today, but I want you to break down what's really behind those numbers.
Well, what's really behind those numbers is we've obviously shut down about half the US economy, and that's having dramatic effects across the country. What we saw today is the government reporting that unemployment has moved up to 4.4%. And the biggest jump in February, it was 3.5. So going from 3.5 to 4.4 was the biggest jump since 1975. And there were just over 700,000 jobs lost in March. Now, if you've been reading any headlines, that sounds really small to you. You're probably going, but what about those 10 million people who lost their supposedly filed for jobless claims in March? The reason today's numbers were low, if you want to say it that way, is because the government does this monthly survey on March 12th. It's hard to remember March 12th. It feels like a century ago, but that was before the president declared a national emergency. It was before the president said we couldn't have more than 10 people in a place at one time. And once that happened on March 16th, we saw these mass closures of the restaurants and the stores and the gyms and the bars and the coffee shops. And that's when we really started to see all of this massive rise, like what we reported yesterday, of close to 10 million Americans filing for jobless claims in March.
Heather, we've also been reporting on trouble people have been having with even filing for unemployment and websites crashing, phone lines being swamped. So what's the hidden story? Like, what's lying below the surface of what we actually know?
There's 2 things lying below the surface. One is these numbers, as incredible, eye-popping, historic as they are not the full picture, because we know, like what you were saying, that I was just on the phone with someone who's been trying to apply for unemployment for 2 weeks now in the state of New York. You have to call in many cases to complete your application in New York, and they and 2 of their family members call repeatedly every day, and they have not been able to get through to complete that application. So that shows you the gravity of what's going on. The other thing we know for certain is this is going to get worse. It's already ugly. What we've seen in the past 2 weeks has basically wiped out nearly 5 years of job gains in this country. It's just, we've never seen this fast of a loss before, and our whole safety net is struggling to keep up.
Tony, you've been tracking gig workers and the tech companies and some of the questions surrounding how gig workers factor into this question of unemployment. What do you want to start with for us to understand and know about how gig workers are being dealt with in this moment?
Right. Well, the hardships are being felt throughout the economy, as Heather was just saying, and it's certainly rearing its head with respect to gig workers. And we're talking about people who drive for Uber or deliver goods on Instacart and for Postmates and things of that sort. for the first time, many of these workers have access to unemployment insurance. Often they don't have those benefits when they're out of work for one reason or another. And that's good news. That's something that Democrats and Republicans really sought as a result of this most recent coronavirus aid package. But for the same reason that, full-time employees are having a hard time, so too are these gig workers at actually accessing those benefits. And then there's this additional layer of bureaucracy and all sorts of other challenges layered on top of it that make it likely that it's going to be many, many weeks before some of these workers can even apply, much less get the checks that they so desperately need. And so, I was talking to a gig worker in New York who was telling me the same thing. He was calling hundreds and hundreds of times, but what he didn't realize was that the system wasn't actually set up at the point at which when he was applying to even get those benefits in the first place. Even if he had gotten through on those phone lines, New York probably couldn't have done anything for him because New York, like many other states, is still waiting for guidance from the federal government. So this is just further adding to the burden on both the regulators and on people who need these checks so desperately.
We've had questions submitted. The Washington Post has a submissions page, so you can see it in our chat section on YouTube, or you can find it on the Washington Post website. And I want to share one question that came from Kabir in New York City, who's asking, when can we expect to see these stimulus payments? And he points out that waiting even 3 weeks for him is just unrealistic because he has bills coming due. So Heather, take us through what we know about the timeline at this point.
So for most people who've been laid off and are desperately waiting for money, there's actually two ways you're going to get money. One is what Tony and I were just talking about, which is the unemployment insurance system. The typical unemployment insurance payment is about $400 a week. However, the Congress, the bill they just passed, adds an additional $600 a week. That money is supposed to flow through the states by today. So hopefully within the next week or two, those checks will go up. If you can get approved, if you can get through the system, that could be a close to $1,000 check every week if you can get into that unemployment system. The other thing that so many of us are hearing about and waiting for is the $1,200 check. Some people call it the stimulus check or the relief check. And those payments are going to pretty much anybody in the United States who earns under $75,000. And you get extra money if you have children who are 16 and under. So if you are waiting for that $1,200 check, the good news is Treasury and the Internal Revenue Service believe they can start sending direct deposits potentially as early as April 9th. The first wave will go out. Now, as Tony has been chronicling and others, you can't send 120 million people a direct deposit on April 9th. Unfortunately, the system would crash. It's not set up for that. The government does not have everybody's bank information. So this is going to go out in batches. And if they don't have your bank account information, they will either mail you a check, or there's supposed to be a web portal created sometime later this month where you can go and input your direct deposit details so you can get that money faster.
This is answering a question that Regina wrote in with from Georgia, asking just how are we, going to get the payments? And we're also just getting more of that anxiety people are expressing. Regina concerned about how she's going to pay for, the bills in her life. So, Tony, I want to hear from you, because we did just hear from Heather some of the details of direct deposit working out. And we'll go into some more of the questions that have been raised about how people who aren't in the direct deposit system might get their money. But Tony, you have been chronicling these technical hurdles, and the IRS has had to do massive payouts of checks before when there's been an economic downturn. But what were lessons learned from those payouts before, and how is this different?
Right. The last time when the IRS sent a lot of these payments out, it was doing it entirely by check, and it did so over the period of many, many months. And those checks got into the hands of Americans, but it didn't happen, I guess, as quickly as perhaps some of those Americans hurt by the last recession would have liked. And I think since then, what we've seen is the same warning after warning from inspectors general, from folks testifying on Capitol Hill, who say that the guts of government, the thing that makes all this stuff work, is a little bit dated, could very much use a bit of an upgrade, and that absent those upgrades, things are just typically going to be slower. And so we're seeing that problem now play itself out in the course of this new economic downturn brought by coronavirus, because the IRS has to come together and create this website so that people who don't have their bank account information on file can submit that data to the government. It's got to do so, by the way, in a fashion that protects that financial data from being stolen from hackers, which is certainly no small feat on the part of the federal government. And then it's got to get those checks out quickly. It's got to actually disperse the money. And there are many different tech tools that perhaps the government might have been able to take advantage of. The same kinds of apps that you and I have on our phones to split the bill when we're buying dinner or buying drinks or something, but the government's just not there. That's just not a technology that we can really reasonably expect the feds to be able to put in place in such short order. So, we're beginning to see how the aging guts of government really affects things in the time of a crisis.
Tony, those companies that you're referring to that we might use to pay somebody or reimburse somebody, like you said, if we're out for dinner or something, some of those companies have been saying to the government, hey, we'll help out, but there's obviously something in it for them, right?
Right. Well, we typically say that there are two things guaranteed in life, and it's death and taxes. But the third is lobbying. And that's what we're certainly seeing around this coronavirus aid package, because so many of these companies want to offer their products and solutions to government, largely because it's a big business boon for them. And so we're talking about things like PayPal, which owns the app Venmo, Square, which allows for cash transfers and things of the sort. And then on the flip side of that, some of the bigger financial players like Visa that have all gone to the government to really try to pitch different sorts of products and services that they say would put money in the hands of Americans a bit faster. And that may be true. It's also generally good for those companies to sort of improve their standing with the federal government to get their teeth in there for future business. But again, many folks that we've talked to have said that it's going to be really hard for the feds to take advantage of that sort of thing. You can't just flip a switch and start Venmoing people, so to speak.
So if 80% of tax filers have their info, already submitted to the government for direct deposit, we've been talking a little bit about everyone else who has to deal with this. And you guys have said that the IRS does plan to develop some kind of web-based portal, but how are you both finding out information about this? Like, what's the tracking and what advice, is the government giving to an American citizen who just wants to be able to know they're doing everything by the book and they're getting their name into the right column, as it were, so that they're included in this? Tony, we can start with you.
I think in talking to a lot of folks for the two stories that we've written so far in the past couple of days, I feel like I've heard the same message from them, which is that they don't know what they're supposed to be getting and when they're going to be getting it. And that's the case when we're talking about employment benefits, the $600 additional benefit that many are expecting each week because they're out of a job, the $1,200 stimulus checks that we're talking about. I just feel each person that I've spoken to has been confused by some part of the process and frustrated that they're not getting that aid more quickly. So I don't know if that's on the government or not. I don't know if that's just because we're sort of in this very, very difficult time right now. There's a lot of information being thrown at people and things are quite urgent, but at least time and again, I've heard that confusion expressed by the people I've talked to.
Heather, I want to throw one more reader question at you. Patricia writes in and is talking about being on Social Security. She says she doesn't make enough money to file a tax return and she gets Social Security through direct deposit. So she's asking if she has to file tax paperwork. Now, Patricia, like many of us, have heard conflicting information about this because we have seen the government, go a couple different directions. So what is your latest reporting on people who are in Patricia's boat?
The good news for Patricia and millions of people like her, both seniors and people who receive Social Security disability, SSDI as it's called, is they do not have to take action. If they don't normally file a tax return, they will automatically receive the $1,200 payment. The government obviously knows how to send them a monthly check, and they are going to use that information to send those people a check. There was some confusion earlier in the week when the IRS said they wanted those people to file some sort of simple tax return. There was a lot of outrage about that, rightfully so. And the good news is the IRS and the US Treasury have sorted that out, and they are going to get those people their money. When it will come, whether that will be the April 9th date or the April 16th or later in April, we don't know, but that is a high priority to get the money to lower income Americans. So I'm hopeful they will see it by the end of April. In terms of the best thing you can do, if you're sitting there, you're one of the people who are hundreds of people who've contacted Tony and me and other reporters, the best thing you can do if you have access to the internet is to keep going to irs.gov census.gov/coronavirus. They do have a pretty helpful Q&A up there. It is updated with the latest information. That is where this simple tax return will appear for the people who do need to file, who are low income and not on Social Security, will have to file a simple tax return. And that is ultimately where the web portal will be to input your direct deposit information.
That's great. It's so helpful. Heather, you've reported on people who won't be getting any money. Tell us about who is left out of this.
The biggest shock of who's not getting money is high school seniors and college students. Most of them will not see anything from this, even if they work. So even if you're working your way through college. So why aren't these people getting any money? It's because the government decided when they wrote this bill that anybody who is a, quote, adult dependent, and they're defining adult as 17 or up. So you could be 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. You could still be living at home. You could even be a disabled person who's maybe 40 or 50 and still living with a relative. But if you are claimed as a dependent on somebody else's tax return, you do not get any money, and that person does not get $500 extra or whatever for you. It's a very strange loophole that they did, but that's how the bill was written. A lot of people are very upset about it.
I also saw, a fair number of questions from readers wondering like what comes next and if there will be another stimulus package. A reader in Virginia wrote in and asked about, what the next expectations are. So Heather, what are you tracking in terms of, the economic forecasters and the people who you talk to? What are they talking about in terms of who else needs help?
There will almost certainly be a stimulus 4, as it's already being called, bill at some point. There is just so much economic carnage. We're talking about a situation that will be probably the worst since the Great Depression in this country, potentially 20 million people out of work. We've already seen about 10 million so far. And a huge concern that we're going to see some businesses go bankrupt. We've already seen some preparations of bankruptcy filings from both small and large companies. So the pain is real, it is happening. What else does Congress need to do? The economists I talk to, the number two, I hear two things over and over again. One is, why doesn't the federal government just pay for all coronavirus treatments? Why do we have this confusion of people who are low income, who are trying to get help, and instead they have to figure out if they can afford it? There's just mind-boggling. The second thing that I hear over and over again is there's a clear need. A lot of this money, a lot of these programs are running through states. That's where people get their unemployment insurance. That's where people get their food stamps. That's where a lot of the health and safety workers are ultimately coming from, whether it's police or EMTs and 911 workers. And those states are in desperate need of more money, and there's widespread agreement across the political spectrum that there's going to need to be more federal money going there. The big question mark is, does the federal government need to do more to, quote, bail out companies? They have done a lot of relief. The Small Business Administration loans went live today. We're in the early phases, but it's good to see the ability for people, including self-employed, including those Lyft drivers that Tony's been writing about. They can also go and apply for these SBA loans. The process, there'll be some glitches, but we're hopeful that works. And the White House has been very clear, if more needs to be done, they're going to do it.
Heather, I'm going to let you go so you can continue reporting. Thank you so much for explaining this in such a clear and concise way. It's so helpful, and I really appreciate your reporting. Tony, I've got a few things I want to follow up with you on, and this is the question of scams, robocalls, fake things that we've been getting. I've been getting texts from people very concerned because they've been getting like panicked messages forwarded that are just not true. So right. Who oversees that, and what can the government do to put an end to that?
Well, it depends on what bucket of bad stuff we're talking about when we're talking about this misinformation around coronavirus.
The bucket of bad, I know. It's like
the bucket of bad.
Taking advantage of people.
So one of the things you mentioned was robocalls. We certainly are seeing an uptick in robocalls related to coronavirus. On some level, that's not surprising. Typically, when we have major national moments, so open enrollment around healthcare or tax day, or what usually is tax day in April, you see these spikes, and coronavirus is no different. We've seen coronavirus related calls that are pitching tests that don't exist and other sorts of medical services that don't exist. So this is stuff that's more than just a nuisance. This is a serious threat. So we've actually seen that there's been more activity on the part of the federal government and the telecom carriers to find and stop this stuff. It's happened more quickly than we typically see it. We actually got some news on this front today from the Federal Communications Commission and its sister agency, which issued essentially some legal letters, some warning letters to different elements of the telecom industry to shut these calls down. That could be a precursor to legal action or various sorts of things to stop these calls. And many of them are coming from abroad. You know, some of them appear to be coming from places like Pakistan, for example, targeting Americans en masse. So definitely an uptick in these threats. The scammers are out there. The malicious actors putting misinformation is out there, but folks are doing their best to try to stop it as quickly as they can.
I want to welcome James Homan. Thank you, James, for joining us. You know, Tony, fake news finds a way, right? And so I guess the best thing people can do is check your sources, figure out what people, if someone's forwarding you a text or something they've heard, it's like, citing your source, where'd you get that information? Where did it come from? Because it can just really prey on people's fear right now. And you point out that it's not just emails and texts, it's also like WhatsApp, it's TikTok, it's any way that you get information and share information, there's a vulnerability. Right, Tony?
Right, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, the companies have taken a more proactive role in this stuff. You know, we've talked for a long time about stopping political falsehoods and stopping other sorts of dangerous, racist, hateful, violent speech online. And Facebook and Google and Twitter often are pilloried for not doing enough to prevent the spread of that. Well, with coronavirus, we've seen a bit of a much different tack. You know, these companies are taking stuff down more aggressively than they otherwise would. And so that's been some good and bad. I think there are some people who are a little uncomfortable by the aggressive nature of the response. There are others who think that they haven't gone far enough because there are still videos on YouTube peddling, you know, falsehoods about how corona spreads. And there are still viral messages on WhatsApp, which is an especially hard tool to police because of the private nature of those communications. So I think at the end of the day, we're going to have to wait and see until we're past this, like how well the companies actually did once we have the data in front of us. But we can definitely say that they're approaching things differently. And this might become a template for how some of these companies are asked to deal with other kinds of dangerous speech in the future.
All right, Tony, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Take care, and we'll talk to you soon. James, your Daily 202 today looked at people losing health insurance and what a terrible time it is to lose your health insurance as you are facing a global pandemic and the threat of yourself or your family being in grave health risk. Talk to us about how the federal government is responding to that and what governors and other leaders are saying about it.
Yeah, Libby, unfortunately, the government isn't responding very well to it. The $2 trillion package that was enacted a week ago included an extension of unemployment insurance, which is certainly helpful for a lot of these folks. We heard Heather talking a couple of minutes ago about the $1,200 checks, although we also heard her explaining how a lot of folks who need that money aren't going to get that money or aren't eligible for it or aren't going to get it for several weeks. But what we haven't really been talking about is a lot of those 10 plus million people who filed for unemployment in March simultaneously lost their employer provided health insurance. And so that's considered a life event. So you can go, the Trump administration has decided not to reopen enrollment for the ACA, for Obamacare. But if you lose your job, it's like getting married or having a child, you're allowed to change your plan. But if you don't have any income and you don't know how long you're not going to have any income, and a lot of these service workers who are losing their jobs, you know, in restaurants and hotels and casinos don't have savings, you can't really do that. You can also get COBRA, but COBRA means that you're paying everything your employer was paying before in full. So you can extend that for up to 18 months. So in the 202 today, I interviewed half a dozen folks who lost their jobs through no fault of their own because of this coronavirus recession. All of them lost their insurance effective April 1st. A lot of times when you lose your job, your insurance is effective through the end of the month. And so each of them, for different reasons, needs health insurance. One guy, 31 years old, had a stroke 2 years ago. One woman who was a housekeeper at a hotel in Connecticut broke her wrist and has to get the cast taken off, but doesn't have the money to pay for it. Another guy in Houston had 3 surgeries over the last year. Another guy's wife is asthmatic and uses his insurance for her inhalers. So all these folks are, facing tough decisions, but also sort of confused about what their options are because no one's really explaining it clearly to them. A lot of times when they were let go, no one said, here are the things you can do for healthcare. So they're confused, they're scared, they don't know what to do, and they have healthcare bills coming up. So in addition to a public health crisis and an economic crisis, we're also looking at, if we have 15, 20% unemployment, what really is a healthcare crisis in this country?
Yeah, it's so fascinating because healthcare was such a key component of the Democratic debates and the Democratic field conversation. I point to the Democrats because that was the competitive race. Obviously, we know President Trump is the Republican nominee, but Democrats were really, fighting over this idea of whether or not you should keep your employer-based insurance, how important it is. And now we are seeing just everything change in that discussion and that debate because employer-based insurance is unfortunately not an option for so many Americans as they lose their jobs.
Yeah, Olivia, it's super interesting you mentioned that because, when the coronavirus first started to become kind of an all-consuming pandemic, Bernie Sanders and his campaign hoped that this would sort of spark an outcry for Medicare for all. That people would say, wow, all these people through no fault of their own, all of a sudden face these massive healthcare expenditures. Why not? This could create a groundswell for a single payer system. And that really was strategically what they were talking about. I remember the day of the Michigan primary, the last day I got to travel for work 3 weeks ago. And the Sanders campaign really believed this created an opening for them to have that conversation. But as we know, no one's paying attention to the presidential race. The Wisconsin primary is in flux, but looks like it's still going to happen next Tuesday. Neither candidate is running a campaign commercial in that state. They haven't for weeks. So this isn't, I think this is something Sanders could be talking about. There is an argument he could be making. You could also push back, substantively on that argument, but no one is having that conversation. And that's, and a lot of the people I talked to, including the president of the Unite Here union, who said more than 90% of his members have lost their jobs in the last month. 90% of his 300,000 members are out of work. And he is kind of irate that Congress didn't do anything on healthcare in the stimulus bill. And he's also particularly upset that no one's talking about it, that people are kind of forgetting these folks and their healthcare struggles.
So what about expanding Medicare and Medicaid eligibility? Because we did see this asked of the president and the vice president just yesterday, but we didn't get much clarity. And in fact, the vice president kind of dodged the question, and then Trump was like joking about how successfully Pence had just managed not to talk about it.
It was quite a moment. These briefings are more than 2 hours, but that was one of the more memorable moments. And it's true. A reporter said, "Are you going to expand Medicaid access?" For a lot of the folks I talked to, even though they're low income, they consider themselves low income, they make more than 130% above the poverty line. It's something like $30,000 for a family. Not very much money when you're trying to feed 5 mouths. And so
that's the cutoff. That's the qualification.
That's the cutoff to qualify for Medicaid. And then a lot of states, when you're applying for Medicaid coverage, they want to see your tax return from last year. And so if you worked all of last year and made $45,000, you're out of luck on Medicaid. So there are some governors who are saying, let's do something about this. Let's expand eligibility. Some White House folks and administration folks have said one of the reasons they're not extending the open enrollment period and they're not doing a lot of this is because there's pending litigation where the administration is trying to invalidate the entire Affordable Care Act. And so they don't want to do anything to create kind of a legal argument for keeping the healthcare system in place as it is. Anyway, so Pence ducked, as you know. Trump kind of joked, Pence talked for 5 minutes and didn't answer a question to a reporter from Fox News. Then Trump did what Trump is wont to do. And he said, we're going to look at this. We're taking it seriously. And he did say, it is very unfair that this is happening to all these people. We're going to be talking about it. But it's clear from my reporting with administration folks and with folks in the healthcare space, this is not something that's really on the table. And it's not something, frankly, even Democrats on Capitol Hill are talking about as part of a potential phase 4 package. They seem to be focused on infrastructure. And there are, again, people who would love to see them talk about healthcare. And maybe if we start to see more stories about people who are really struggling, that conversation will change. But for now, there's really not. Everyone is so consumed by kind of the daily death toll, understandably, and getting ventilators to folks who need them, understandably. But the kind of this other longer tail healthcare crisis is looming. And no one right now is really doing anything for them.
Let's talk about who's making decisions on the coronavirus task force. From the White House, we saw Jared Kushner yesterday take to the podium, and that was a new face to see representing the White House. There was a lot of criticism over Jared Kushner, what he said, and also a lot of questions about his role, specifically as he talked about the strategic national stockpile and just who those resources should be going to.
You really can't make this stuff up. He tends to keep a low profile. He's taken on a more and more active role, partly at Trump's urging because of Trump's frustration with kind of the uneven response initially to the pandemic. So Kushner comes out last night and he says, look, the national stockpile is not for the states, it's for the federal government. And to back up the states are supposed to have their own stockpile. And literally the website for the national stockpile says this stockpile is for the states. And so this morning they went and changed the language to match what
on the website
Jared said last night on the national website. Now FEMA claiming, and there's good reason to not believe them, FEMA's claiming this was in the works before, but this is kind of the government. We have lots of reporting now about if governors are lucky enough to get the president on the phone, they can ask for stuff, and then the president will say to FEMA or HHS or the coronavirus task force, get them their masks, get them whatever. And so this has kind of become a very politicized process a lot of times, where red states like Florida are getting everything they ask for. Blue areas like the district, which is not a state, getting very little, if anything, of what they asked for. DC didn't get a single ventilator that it requested from the federal government, and it's partly because Trump himself is picking a lot of the winners and losers.
James, Nancy from Oregon wrote in and asked why Washington, D.C. was treated as a territory in the stimulus package, a question that many leaders here in Washington had as well. It is important to point out that not just D.C., but also Maryland and Virginia just got a fraction of what they've requested from FEMA.
Yeah, Libby. And so the reason is this bill was written by the Senate. The Senate is controlled by Republicans. D.C., not a state. D.C. has no senators. And so the earlier bill, the previous bill, Nancy Pelosi and House Democrats were in the driver's seat and basically wrote it. This one was basically written by Senate Republicans. They control the Senate and the White House, and they wanted to treat DC as a territory. And Democrats kind of made some effort. It's not clear how much to change that. Chris Van Hollen, the senator from Maryland, says he tried. 25 Democratic senators have now signed on to an open letter saying DC should be treated as a state, which would entitle it to hundreds of millions of more dollars as it stands. Even though DC is kind of could potentially become one of the real hot spots here, and there's so many cases and deaths. States like Wyoming and Montana are poised just because they're states. They are states. It's not an air quote. Because they're states, they're going to get significantly more resources because of the funding mechanism in the bill. Those states have 2 senators. DC doesn't, and that's why representation matters. And our license plates in DC say taxation without representation. And it's because there wasn't anyone in the Senate who could have said, no, I'm not going to vote for this bill if DC is not treated as a state. It's just the political reality.
So, James, who holds the administration accountable? I know there's talk in Congress of oversight and watching this, but talk about like the short-term accountability versus the long-term accountability, because it's creating high anxiety for people who live in blue states who have needs that are equal to those in red states. And also, of course, governors are just scrambling and sort of alternating between having to fight with each other over supplies and then saying, this is crazy. We can't be fighting with each other. We need to, have a better system to do this. Where's the accountability?
Ultimately, it's going to be with the voters in November. But I mean, I think you think about what was a month ago or 2 months ago and how much that feels like an eternity. But it's hard to see the November election, unless we go to war with Iran or something, riding on anything other than stuff related to this pandemic. And the president realizes that, his aides realize that. I think that's one of the reasons he made the decision to extend the distancing guidelines for a month. He knows that his reelection is going to depend on how he handles this. And I think that's also one of the reasons why he's more helpful to swing states than blue states that he doesn't think are going to vote for him. But in the short term, this, not to toot our own horn, but the media is playing a critical role here. There are a lot of people inside the government who are talking to us when they're not allowed to be, because they're concerned about things that are going on and decisions that are being made that they don't think are in the best interests of public health, and trying to get the word out about some of these more politicized decisions. And then it's important for governors. They face this balancing act because on the one hand, they want to speak up when they feel like they're getting wronged by the federal government, and on the other, you have a president who has who is very proudly transactional and has said, I return calls from people who say nice things about me. And so these blue state governors face a challenge kind of between stroking Trump's ego to deliver for their constituents, which is what they care about most, versus sort of like sounding the alarm that they're not getting what they're asking for. Different governors have handled that differently. And so that's in the short term, the accountability. The second thing is Nancy Pelosi did announce yesterday that she's going to create a special committee to oversee kind of the stimulus. Adam Schiff, who we remember from impeachment, announced officially today, he's been talking about it for a couple of days now, that he's going to create a 9/11 style commission to look at the intelligence failures in the lead up to the pandemic, sort of the warning signs that were missed and not taken seriously. But the Pelosi committee, which is going to be chaired by Jim Clyburn, the South Carolina congressman who so kind of pivotally endorsed Joe Biden before the South Carolina primary, Clyburn's going to chair this committee, and they're going to be focused on trying to get, who the Treasury Department has this essentially a big slush fund of money that they can kind of give out as they want. And there are some requirements about what they have to tell Congress. In his signing statement a week ago, Friday night, the White House put out a press release basically saying we're not going to comply with certain parts of this law related to oversight that we don't like because it ties the president's hands and executive power. And so there are going to be some clashes between the legislative and executive branches over this. Eventually, the administration is going to have to disclose who got the money. We do know they're barred under the law from giving money to Trump organizations. But that doesn't mean that Trump allies and friends aren't going to end up getting kind of special treatment. So the Congress is going to be looking at that, and I assure you, we'll be looking at that as well.
All right, let's talk about the commanding officer of the USS Theodore Roosevelt. He was relieved from command by the acting Navy secretary. This was after he talked about concern over what was happening on his ship and what was happening to the people under his command. Tell us what we know about the justification for relieving him and where the conversation has gone.
So the Navy secretary, the acting Navy secretary, a Trump appointee, removed him last night, kind of explained the decision. And today there's some finger pointing. The White House claims they didn't know, or that it wasn't their call. The defense secretary saying he agreed he'd back up the acting secretary, but that he didn't make the decision. And it's because there's a real blowback from a lot of family members of crew of the USS Teddy Roosevelt, who are in some cases now are talking on the record. And there's a video that's gone viral that's emerged today of the captain leaving the ship and the crew members chanting his name, chanting in some cases "GOAT," greatest of all time. And he sort of got a really raucous goodbye. And it was because a lot, more than 100 of the guys on the ship and women have the coronavirus, and he was trying to get them help. Ultimately, he got it. Now, what the Pentagon says is that he embarrassed the military. He potentially gave information to American adversaries by tipping them off that, we weren't, or one of our nuclear aircraft carriers in the South Pacific wasn't on, full readiness. And the acting Navy secretary said he showed poor judgment by sharing this 4-page memo, basically, that he wrote, pleading for help, pleading for his sailors to be taken care of. He forwarded that email to 20 people, and one of those people sent it to the San Francisco Chronicle, which is his hometown newspaper. He grew up in Santa Rosa. And so the acting Navy secretary said, whether he leaked it or not, we're not saying he did. By sending it to so many people, he basically assured that it was going to leak out to the press. Bottom line, though, the sailors are being taken care of now because he went public, and so he was relieved of his command. But they got what they needed, and he's in a position. That's one of those. That role is kind of considered a stepping stone to admiral, and so I've been in touch today with a lot of Navy guys who all say that either he already knew he was going to get passed over for admiral, or he really made a huge career sacrifice for his men.
I want to throw a question at you, James, that came in from one of our readers. M. Hodell wrote in from St. Louis, Missouri, and asked if it's acceptable that the White House is saying that we should just expect at this point 100,000 to 240 to 250,000 deaths in the course of coronavirus. Now, while it's not, up to you to decide if that's acceptable or not, what I'd love to talk with you about is something that we've all been watching, which is the White House setting expectations in an attempt to sort of contain and manage the public's expectations of what's to come in the coming weeks and months. So this person writing in, wondering if it's acceptable, but what calculation is the White House making?
So the president spent weeks downplaying the risk, obviously, and even last week, which feels like forever ago, Debbie Birx, the coordinator of the White House task force, was calling estimates that 2 million people could die if nothing happened alarmist and saying it was irresponsible for the media to report on them. And then the president sort of, because he was trying to sell his decision to go against some of his own advisors and to go against his friends on Wall Street and in the business world to extend the social distancing guidelines to the end of April, the president decided to kind of lean into the worst case scenario. So he came out on Sunday night and said, more than 2 million people could die if I didn't do anything. And then he started saying as the week goes on, and he's been sharpening it, I'm saving 2 million lives, or 1.8 million lives who would die anyway. And that is part of the managing expectations. Now, there's a lot we don't know about the 100 to 250,000 number. Birx and Tony Fauci, they kind of have said, to be fair, these models are imprecise. They're models. They said that they looked at a dozen different models, but they have not shared their data for how they got there, or sort of their math for how they got there. So there are people on the White House staff. Fauci himself privately in the Situation Room said, this model doesn't really seem realistic. The people in the vice president's office who are kind of like, some of the people have been cited by the White House, the epidemiologists, saying this doesn't quite really make sense. And that this isn't kind of a sacrosanct thing. The other thing that's critical to note is that collectively, this is sort of in our control. So the new White House talking point this week has been, even if we do everything right, 100,000 to 250,000 Americans are going to die. But if we do social distancing perfectly, we really can limit the spread. And so this is in our control. And there is data that we saw this week that is really powerful when you drill into it, from Washington State and California, that shows in California, 1,100 fewer people died than the initial model based on the trajectory they were on. And it's because they were able to flatten the curve by stay-at-home orders, by getting people to stay at home. So when we start talking about 150, 200,000, 1,100 people is a lot of people. That's a lot of lives to be saved. And anyway, so these models can, they're not perfect. The models are changeable. There's 100 factors, but they should kind of, looking at them should shape our behavior. But it's hard. You sort of understand why people don't want to throw these numbers out, and obviously the media, everyone, not just the media, everyone's going to glom onto the worst case scenario and kind of like worry about that. But the models do serve sort of a purpose.
I do want to point out this story by a team of reporters at the Post, getting at what you were talking about, which is that experts, even Trump's advisors, aren't totally sure where they came up with this number. And one of the reasons why it's important to understand that is just because then we can look at the data and get a better sense of the hows and the whats, which have then come up with the ultimate number. So everyone's kind of puzzling over that a little bit. But James, as you talk about how effective social distancing is proving to be, it does raise the question about why there's such a patchwork approach across the country. And we are seeing Tony Fauci come out and say that it would make sense to have every state, have a call for a true social distancing model. And we're still not seeing that across the country. We're
not. And we're still seeing governors hold off. One of the problems, Libby, is the patchwork of testing as well. So Abbott Labs has these testing kits. There's been a debate in the White House this week about where to send them. The president got himself tested a second time, tested negative, kind of this new 15 minutes or less test. The mayor of Detroit called up the CEO and chairman of Abbott Labs in the middle of the night on Sunday to beg him to send testing kits to Detroit, which has become a hotspot. He got 5,000 because of that call. And so the number of confirmed cases as a result went up. big time because of that. And one of the things Dr. Birx said at yesterday's White House briefing was that the majority of test results are not being reported to the federal government. And that matters because, basically, she said more than 600,000 tests have been done and not reported. And so that makes it hard to kind of know where different areas of the country have cases. And so I think in some of these states that don't have stay-at-home orders, they have the coronavirus right now. People are spreading it around. People are asymptomatic, but they don't have a lot of tests there. And so we don't know, and we aren't seeing numbers there. And we'll start to see them next week and the week after, and it's going to be truly terrible. And there is a real concern among the serious medical people that I talk to every day that the people are going to die because these decisions are being put off until kind of it happens here. And it really is, that's 72 hours ago, Florida didn't have a stay-at-home order statewide. Now it's number 5 in cases and growing, and that's partly because people were spreading it around.
James Hohmann, thank you so much. I've got James, I've got Amy Joyce joining us, the editor and writer of On Parenting. You guys write 2 of my favorite newsletters, James, the Daily 202. So James, will say thank you to you and let you go, and then pivot to Amy, who is one of my other favorite newsletters, On Parenting, which comes out on Tuesdays and Fridays. And you can look for that by going to Washington Post and just searching On Parenting. Amy, thank you so much for taking time to talk with us. We wanted to end today's broadcast at the end of the week here to talk with you about what you're learning from experts about how parents are coping with this time. Because, parents are often really the lucky ones if they have a job, if they've got kids that are healthy and well, but it's a lot to juggle. It is a lot to juggle. So
you think?
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the challenges that face families generally, and then we can go into some of the challenges that are facing sort of people with specific aged kids. But what are you hearing from people who are writing to you and sort of seeking advice, and the experts, and how they're weighing in on how families can cope with it?
Well, just like you said, it is incredibly overwhelming, isn't it? You and I both know, and I'm hearing from parents all over the place, with a wide range of ages, just help. I don't know how to do this. And frankly, there's no model for this. Nobody knows how to do this. So a lot of the experts are going through this themselves right now, and they're making it up as they go. But the one common theme is forgive yourself a little bit. Don't worry if your kids aren't learning as much as they had learned in school. Don't worry if they're maybe in front of screens more often. You've got to just sort of give yourself a break and understand you're doing the best you can, and we're trying to make this all work.
I think changing the expectation is helpful, because it does seem like parents are supposed to be teachers right now, stellar employees, managing a household. So one of the things that a lot of families struggle with is screen time. And I've read so many pieces in On Parenting about screen time and what experts say about that. And it seems like all the advice that we've been hearing for years now is sort of, what use is it? So what are you hearing from people?
So I think people have been really upset a little bit and worried, because we've been learning and hearing for so long, okay, under the age of 18 months, absolutely no screens. And up to age 5, only 1 hour a day. And that has to be quality programming. And older than that, not much more. And so here we are, all of a sudden we're, not only letting them be on screen so we can work and get things done and entertain them when they're locked inside and not able to have play dates, but also this is how they're learning now. So they are in front of screens for many hours a day. But in many cases too, it is part of the downtime that we need to fill, whether it's Mr. Rogers or watching a documentary or, watching a family movie together. But what is interesting and helpful is I spoke to actually one of the women with the American Academy of Pediatrics who actually wrote those screen time regulations that we all follow and that our pediatricians tell us to follow. And she has 2 kids herself. And she said, this is not the time to worry about that. Definitely have some boundaries and definitely have some rules and regulations, but you're going to have more screen time now than you normally do. And that's okay. You just have to get through this and forgive yourself a little bit, give yourself a break, and just try to keep it not too crazy, make it quality entertainment, quality educational kind of things as much as possible, but definitely, and keep those boundaries, but forgive yourself a little bit.
So let's talk about challenges that are specific to different age groups. Let's start with little kids, the challenges facing parents with little kids at home right now.
Yeah, so it's crazy. It's pretty intense. You've got little kids running around and you can't do the normal things that you can do. You can't go to the playground, you can't have play dates. And they don't understand, it's hard enough for us adults to understand. And so a lot of parents are just sort of at the end of their rope. And I think one thing that they're finding is they do have to forgive themselves, get a little creative. There've been there's a lot of online programming right now, a lot of things like Common Sense Media, which is a really helpful site, and it tells us what's good for kids and what isn't. They've started a new online school. There's something called OutSchool where kids can sit and learn different things based on what they're interested in, even the smallest kids. But it's hard. You've got to get creative, and you are not going to be able to work from 9 until 7 like you maybe used to do. You have to break it up, and you have to break up the schedule. If you have a partner, lucky you, and you have to block off a schedule to keep your small ones entertained and moving around. One thing that keeps coming up is make sure they get outside, make sure you get a lot of air. That'll tire them out, that'll help them balance themselves out and regulate themselves a little bit. So get outside and do more things like that. But one thing I think a lot of us need to realize is we're going to have to do a lot more playing than we're used to if we can. There are single parents out there. There are parents who are still working and have to go outside of the house, and they've got different challenges. But smaller kids just have to set things aside and do things a little differently than usual.
And important to point out too, it's not just people who are trying to keep their job, might be working from home. It's also people who are looking for a new job or looking for new ways to make ends meet. Or just, so many of us are facing sort of unprecedented circumstances where we need to be in the house and share that space with our families in a way that, Amy, just has never happened before. I mean, this really is new.
Right.
Let's talk about kids who are a little older, some of those middle kids who do have the comprehension maybe to understand what's going on, but might not totally have the nuance that like a high schooler or a college kid might in terms of being able to really appreciate what's at stake. What are you hearing from experts in terms of managing their emotions and also trying to help them through this?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I had my 10-year-old this week said to me, okay, so tell me again what this means. I'm healthy. My friends are healthy. Why can't we play together again? It is very hard to understand. So we have to explain to them, and the experts say, take your time, explain to them. You're going to have to say it more than once. You don't have to tell them too much. And the experts also like to reiterate, try to keep the news off when the kids are around, because it feels very scary, not just to kids, but to us as well. So be as comforting as you can. And sort of like with the screen times, rules that you might have had 3 or 4 weeks ago are going to be a little more lax now, and that's okay. You have to forgive yourself, but for all of that. But in the same time, it's okay to talk to them, about what is going on and why we have to stay away from each other. And in the meantime, I'm here, and we're here together, and we're safe, and here's what we can do. And we can FaceTime grandma and grandpa, even though we can't hug them, and we can do a Zoom meeting with our class and meet with our friends that way. And I know it's different, but this will end. This is not permanent. And just sort of talk through it with them as much as you can without giving away too many details that they're not mature enough for yet.
For parents of teenagers and even tweens, there's an expectation right now that those kids are still doing schoolwork. And
Right.
Many of them are doing schoolwork from home, which raises a lot of questions, of course, about having the adequate technology. Most families don't have like a computer for every human being in their house. What are you hearing about how to talk about this with some of those teenagers and how we can respect what they're going through? Because sometimes what teenagers go through is so important to them, and it might seem like not as big of a deal to us. Oh, you're missing an event, you're missing a sweet 16 birthday party or something like that. But to them, those are such important events.
Yeah, I mean, to them, this is their world. And this is such a pivotal time for tweens and teens. They're building these relationships, and they're trying to figure out where they fit in the world. And now they're separated from everybody. And I think a lot of them are very, very lonely, and they just want their life back. They miss their baseball teams. They miss their friends. We've got seniors who are missing prom and all of these sort of rites of passage. And in many ways you can say, yes, but there's a global pandemic going on. That's not important. Well, it is important. That is their life. That is what they know. And so we have to be there to support them through it, and also understand that maybe if they have a blowout or a fight with us, it's not because of us. It's because they are going through a crazy time, a huge transition themselves. And we have to be understanding that.
And that we need to watch for moods and depressions and making sure that kids are doing okay as they deal with this themselves.
Right. And that is happening a lot. And so it's important for us to build in time for them to have some conversations with their friends and some ways to meet them socially, but on screens, and sort of bend to what they need a little bit more now than we might normally bend to. If they've had it with school for the day, that's okay. Let them stop. And, they will learn, but sometimes you just need to get up and take a break and let them do what they need to do.
College kids, a lot of college kids returning home in ways and at times they did not expect to. Some of whom had really exciting new opportunities lined up for their summer after graduation. And so much of this is just dissolving in front of them. So what are you hearing from experts about how the parents of college kids who are suddenly back in the nest can deal with that situation?
Right. And again, it's a lot of listening to them and what they need. They might not want to eat dinner with you every night. They might want to hole up in their bedroom a little bit and be with their friends on their phones, and that's okay. You might be, as a parent, expecting, oh gosh, this is great. Everybody's home together again, board games every night. That might not be what they want and what they need, and we need to listen to that. And yeah, a lot of their dreams have suddenly been crushed. They had great jobs for the summer. They had a lot of plans with their friends. They had spring break plans that they canceled or hopefully canceled. And now they are stuck at home in their old bedroom with mom and dad looking over them.
And also perhaps separated from like a girlfriend or boyfriend, like
right.
new relationships in their lives are suddenly put on hold.
Everything. It's going to be very traumatic for them. And it's just important as parents that we listen and we're there for them as much as we need. And if you do see your child, no matter the age, college age, younger, sort of spiraling or holding up in their rooms a little bit, you have to pay attention to that and do something for them as far as that goes. And there's a lot of therapy that kids can get online right now, and it might be very necessary, but at the same time, if they're doing some of that, it's probably pretty normal, and you have to just sort of let them do that and be there for them no matter what, but also not force them to be with you too much, even though you're all under the same roof.
Amy, Caitlin Gibson wrote a powerful piece for On Parenting about the parents of adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and what just an excruciating and challenging moment this is for families who might suddenly be cut off from access from their loved ones. Can you talk to us about her reporting on that?
So Caitlin reported on this. It was a bit of a wrenching story, but you forget how many layers are out there right now. And the opening anecdote she had of this mom who's used to taking her grown son out for, his birthday lunch, and he's confused. He doesn't know why he can't see her. And she realized, oh my gosh, I have to stay away from him to keep him safe. And so, like with so many of these stories, you realize, okay, this is one angle, but look, there are these whole other, sides of this parenting issue. They can't be near each other for each other's health and safety. And yet these grown adult children don't understand why this is happening and why their mother's not with them or not near them, and why they can't go do their volunteer work that they do, or their job that is so important to them, or, the structure and the schedule that they need every day to feel sort of stable and confident. But here we are. And so, not only are the kids stuck and confused, but frankly, the parents are as well, because we've never been through this before.
And it also just points out the extra challenge for any parents of kids with disabilities who just might not have access to special services, any sorts of therapy, community events they're used to doing, classes outside the home, or even specialists coming to their home.
Right.
So that is cut off right now.
It is, and it's such a challenge. And so a lot of parents are struggling just to teach their own children who are regular, or learning in regular ways at home. But there are so many parents out there who have their children have services at school that they cannot access now, and it's just so difficult. And so what a lot of parents are finding and saying is you've just got to sort of get through, they aren't going to have the same schedule, they aren't going to have the same situation, and you don't have to make them keep learning in the same way. You just have to do what they need to get through this time and to keep them as happy and comfortable as possible.
So Amy, before we let you go, have you been getting a lot of letters and emails, and are you hearing from a lot of your readers? And then how do you talk to people about what resources there are for them to access? Because this is a moment where I think so many of us are looking for community and we're looking for answers, but also just sort of basic connection.
Yeah, people are looking for a lot of connection, and that's helpful. We're hearing from a lot of parents who write to us through the newsletter, or we've got a Facebook page called On Parenting and Work, and it's a discussion page, and there's a lot of talk there about how everyone's sort of getting through this time and creating schedules, and also recreating schedules. You might think you're doing one thing the right way, and then you just got to throw that out the window and start over again. When all of this started, everybody seemed so enthusiastic, and there were all these memes and schedules online, and people were printing them out and copying them. And I might have done that too for a day or two, and those immediately went in the recycling bin, and we're just doing what we need to do as a family and hope that we can keep things as stable as possible.
Yeah. One thing I'm trying to remember is my kids will be stressed if I'm stressed. So trying to reduce personal stress can be
right
for everyone in the family. So
right. And as soon as that starts happening, it's good to go out and take a walk if you can.
Yeah.
Away from people though.
Amy, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time on this Friday afternoon. Again, Amy Joyce is the editor and also writes for On Parenting. You can see that on Tuesdays and Fridays. You can get that emailed to you, but otherwise, just if you just do a search for On Parenting in the Washington Post, it'll pop up and you can find out more about all the writing that's there. So, Amy, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. And thanks to all of you, our viewers, for watching this. I'm Libby Casey, and we really appreciate you joining us. We'll be back next week on Tuesday and Thursday at 3:00 Eastern Time with more of our reporters to talk about the latest news in this coronavirus story. Until then, stay safe and stay healthy, and I look forward to seeing you next week.